Well, now we're really pleased to have with us here in the studio former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, who is now running the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And I'll start putting you on the spot a little bit, but we're very curious to know how many COPs you reckon you've been to?
I can't remember.
And that's a great answer, because it's been a lot, hasn't it?
It's been a lot. But I was involved in the very first treaty, the Kyoto Treaty, back in 1997, 98. And, you know, back then it was all about trying to persuade people that climate change was a problem. And so for, I would say, the best part of 2 decades, the argument was, no, it really is a problem. And people were saying, well, we're not sure, or there's some people denying it. But actually, I think now everyone accepts as a problem. The question is, what's the solution that's going to work?
That's what I was going to ask you. So you do think there's been progress made on the world accepting it is a problem?
I think there's been massive progress made on the world accepting it's a problem. There are very few people who don't say that there's any issue on climate change, because people see whatever part of the world you're in, you can see the climate changing. So I don't think that's such a problem. And there has been significant progress on some of the solutions. But the problem is the world keeps developing. And therefore, whereas the developed world was responsible for creating the problem through its industrialization, the developed world's emissions will be a declining percentage of the total over time. And the developing world, because it wants and needs to develop for its people, will become a larger and larger element. And the question, therefore, is how do you get the financial flows going from the developed world to the developing world? How do you make sure that when countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam in Southeast Asia, and then, of course, in time, Africa, how do they grow, but do it in a way that doesn't keep adding to the emissions? So this is the challenge. You've got finance and then you've got technology, which is the other big challenge.
One of the big urgencies is obviously mitigating, as they call it in UN language, but the use of fossil fuels, the reliance on that. And you say that is eventually going to go down, not up, but they are predicted to keep rising until at least 2030. So, I mean, what can really be done about that?
Yeah, so what can be done is 2 things. You've got to make sure that when it's possible, because you've got the opportunities through, for example, renewable energy, when countries in the developing world are increasing their power production, power generation, they could be doing it more sustainably with renewable energy. In Africa, for example, there are massive opportunities for hydropower, for geothermal power. So the solution for solar, of course, in Africa, but you need the financing. So that's the challenge. And you're absolutely right. The fossil fuel production is going to continue to rise. It may peak in 2030, but we need it to peak sooner if at all possible, and then we need for it to start declining. And the other aspect of this is technology. There are new technologies being developed, and we're going to have to try and accelerate those so that we can get them deployed. Otherwise, frankly, meeting these climate targets is going to be really tough.
Let's focus back on why we're here, why you are here, and we're here on this COP29 Daily Show in Baku, because what can COP do, this UN climate change conference? What can it do to help with that, to help fix
so
these
the COPs really have 2 purposes. One is to be a global platform so that people, because often the countries with the least power are going to be the most affected by climate change, right? Some of the poorest countries, for example, in the Sahel in Africa, or a lot of the island states, they don't have huge amounts of money or power, but they're going to be really affected by climate change. And one purpose of COP is to give people a voice so that people can come and they can put pressure on the international community. But the second, and perhaps in the end, the most important, is you get countries to commit to things that can offer solutions. So this COP will very much be around finance, where the organizers of the COP, the government of Azerbaijan, will be trying to improve the amount of finance that goes to improve our chances of beating climate change, and then also to try and, they've got a particular idea around how you make carbon markets work more effectively, so that you generate more money from the developed world to the developing world.
Look, you mentioned those carbon markets is something I want to talk to you about. It's a big agenda point here, and I think it's something that you probably are looking into quite a lot in the work that you're doing now. before we go any further, do our audience a massive favour and try and explain in simple terms what carbon markets are and why they're important.
Well, carbon markets are important because if you are emitting, right, the question is how you manage to use that in order to then in the developing world, people can you put a value on that and then you transfer that to the developing world so they're actually investing in energy in that developing world. So the whole point about a carbon market is that you allow people to trade emissions, right? So the people that are emitting can then help reduce the impact of their carbon footprint by putting money into the developing world. So the problem has always been with the carbon markets that it's been difficult to make them transparent. So, for example, people might want to invest in preventing deforestation, right? So you have to make sure that that system has integrity so people really see that what you say you're doing, you're actually doing, right? And the problem has always been with the carbon markets, making sure they operate effectively, transparently in a way that allows us to get more money into those developing world into the developing world that needs that money.
So you think it's an effective system to be cleaning up and sorting out and getting...
It's effective. I mean, there are criticisms that people make of it because they think you're giving the emitters a free pass. But in the end, you know, there will be industries and there will be countries that will continue to emit. So to have a system of trading for emissions and emissions reductions is, I think, a perfectly sensible thing to do.
So is that going to be part of your conversations going on here at COP?
Yeah, absolutely.
What else will you be looking at? What would be your measure of success from this COP?
Well, I think first of all, that you actually get the amount of money that is flowing from the developed world to the developing world. And that can happen, it can happen directly. It can happen also through, through the institutions like the World Bank and other multilateral institutions, providing guarantees, providing concessionary loans for the developing world to be able to invest in renewable energy. You see, the problem is that every year, a lot of these developing countries are going to be increasing their power generation, and they will want to be building airports, having well-functioning airlines and travel, right? So unless you find a way where you're allowing the investment in renewable energy to happen much more quickly, so you're getting people then investing in, solar and renewable and so on, and unless you find ways, for example, with aviation, of making sure that people are going to be able to travel, but using sustainable aviation fuel, it's going to be really hard to make the climate change debate work, because we know, for example, airline travel is going to double over the next 20 years.
Yeah.
And therefore, the whole point that, as I always say to people about climate change, is you're not going to stop people consuming. The world will carry on growing. You can't say to a leader of a poor country whose people desperately need electricity, connectivity, who need the road transport and so on, you can't say to them, don't develop. What you can do, if you provide the finance and the means, is say, here's a way of doing it sustainably, not damaging the environment.
And have the developed countries and all
and
the
this is a
institutions
responsibility of the
playing part in
developed
it.
countries. Look, we created the problem, but as I say to people, the fact that we created the problem means that we've got a responsibility to deal with it, but dealing with it over time is going to be more and more about how we deliver the finance and the technology to the developing world.
Well, we'll let you get on with that work. I know you've got plenty to be getting on with here at COP. Thank you very much, former Prime Minister of the UK and Executive Chair of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Tony Blair.
Thank you.